Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Makona Man at YouTube with another modelling video. Today we are doing our 8th installment of honing your airbrushing skills, and I want to take things a tad further than just general maintenance and drawing lines. Having a think about it for a while, I would like to actually demonstrate painting my actual kits in between the cleaning process of my airbrush, as well as documenting maintenance and whatnot. Now, during the process of airbrushing over this past month and a bit, the rear washer from the back of the paint chamber has been deteriorating rapidly, and I've been getting occasionally these backbursts of paint when the air lines are tad clogged, and a ton of paint is just pumped out via the trigger hole. Now, as you're going to see, I'm still able to airbrush fairly efficiently, even though with this fault that you'll see in this video. Unfortunately, it is inconvenient, and if I wasn't lubricating the internals, the airbrush would just absolutely gunk up and refuse to work. At this stage, I'm not too sure if I'm going to buy an O-ring and attempt to repair it by plugging the back of it, or if I'm going to retire this old dog and try to get my hands on a new Sparmax or similar frame DH103 airbrush. I'm still very fond of this frame. I still love the fact that the parts are very cheap, and we'll continue going with the series, but maybe with a new airbrush. This guy's been going close to 10 years, and I think it's probably soon time for him to rest. So first thing first, going through my maintenance regime, the air tank was emptied of any moisture inside, as well as the water trap. The airbrush cable was laid flat on the ground. The compressor was charged up. The valve opened and flushed any water that may also be in the actual hose. It's only a few dollars, but a couple of valves like so, 1/4 inch on your compressor, is definitely worthwhile for ease of airbrushing and maintenance. The airbrush looks pretty neat on the outside. Pulling it apart on the inside, all the pieces are still caked in petroleum jelly lube, Vaseline. There is quite a bit of caked paint on top of it that hasn't quite settled. Because I've lubricated all the moving bits, including the air solenoid, the needle and the spring, the paint never had a chance to set and harden and just seize up the entirety of the airbrush. It was able to move quite smoothly. So in this experiment, I definitely say that lubricating from the rear of the paint cup is definitely worthwhile if your O-ring at the back of the paint cup is working or not. It just feels like a new airbrush every time, and it's prevented this thing from just absolutely seizing up and damaging the needle or nozzle. Once dismantled, the pieces were immediately submerged in lacquer thinner and put into this small Chinese food container. The Ultrasonic Cleaner, which I still think is absolutely mandatory for airbrush use. This particular model that I may have mentioned well before was available on eBay. It goes for around $30–40. I bought it off a friend secondhand, very, very cheap. But it just saves so much time that it removes all paint, grease, everything easily. And once you pull out, you just give it a bit of a rub down with paper toweling. Looking at the dirty thinner after it's soaked for a few hours and actually vibrated all the crud out, you can see that the thinner is absolutely filthy, and the airbrush just comes out sparkling new and beautiful. Just saying, if you can afford an airbrush rig with compressor and an extraction booth, you could definitely afford this ultrasonic cleaner. I think it's going to save the life of your parts and whatnot. All the pieces are laid out and dried. The appropriate components rear of the paint cup has been lubricated with Vaseline and completely assembled, ready to go. Now, as always, I practice painting my line, so I thin the paint a little more than usual, so greater than 50/50. The PSI was set less than 15. started painting lines. I've noticed because due to the mention of the last video, the needle has been wearing down. The nozzle, which I've been using the extra thin plastic cement treatment, is also wearing out. They've both been had their life extended substantially from my usual style of painting. Because I spray with a lot of primers, and especially thick primers like Mr. Surface 500, it's going to really work the parts in your airbrush. If you have a more expensive airbrush or expensive parts, don't prime. If you do have a workhorse, DH103, definitely prime with it with how cheap nozzles and needles are. So yeah, your Iwatas, your Paches, definitely only paint. Have an older, dirtier DH103, at least for priming. The ones on eBay are seriously not too bad, the $20, $30 ones. So I drew lines, not exactly neat, but no speckling, no fuzzing, very neat straightforward gradient lines. Quite happy with the result. The airbrush is well tuned and ready to take another month of abuse. Pulled out the old test tank, and I just did a bit of test pre-shading with extra thin paint. Fairly tight lines. Remember, this is a 70-second kit, and I think I am definitely ready for some painting work. All footage and information beyond this point of the video has occurred before the maintenance session on this airbrush. I am currently working on the Big Club 1100 Leo in resin. You may have seen on Facebook, initially finish painted this kit and mounted it on the base. Fairly unhappy with how I've painted it, even though it's all gradient and shaded, including a couple of mistakes with the paint scratching. I dumped it in a bucket of chlorine and did the old paint stripping method and started from scratch. I'm spraying one of the thigh pieces in this video, so you'll see the process of shading a kit with multiple colours of paint to get a lighting effect, which is fairly new to me at this stage. As always with these experimental videos, do not consider this as some sort of tutorial. It is good general advice, but I would recommend practicing it and trying it for your own methods before you do it outright on a good model kit. Unless you're prepared to strip it, of course. A while ago, all seam lines, imperfections, dents have been filled with squadron putty. Then sanded back, sprayed with Mr. Surfacer 500, then sanded back again, ready for priming. The primer I'm using is Mr. Surfacer 1500. I've done a review on it. Excellent primer, very, very thin, at the consistency of paint, but at the properties and etching ability of a primer. This is going to be thinned 50-50, tiniest touch of retardant, PSI set approximately 15, probably a tad higher, and the paint is generally and very lightly dusted on all around the piece until I have an absolute solid colour. I cannot see the difference or shades between the putty and the resin. It is all completely grey. Once the build-up of paint is sufficient, it is fairly thin layers. So you do multiple layers, you just dust on a fine layer, look at it. It dries fairly instantly, and you're able to do this multiple times while still holding the brush, to the reason why we got it at the lowest PSI. When you're spraying, you just rock the needle back ever so slightly, and you just allow the Mr. Paint to collect on the surface of the kit. This does produce a bit of overspray, but you're not going to get any droopy lines or runs or any sort of errors occurring, including that the paint is going to dry fairly instantly. I do warn, in certain days of temperature you are at risk of orange peel, so don't dust too far away, get nice and close. The next session, we are using Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black, also a primer. It is not being used as a primer. Thinned a little more than 50-50, PSI rocked back closer to 10-11. Very, very lightly, again rocking the airbrush, though the nozzle in a fairly closed position. I'm tightly painting lines around the edge for a pre-shaded effect. When you're doing your practicing in the honing your airbrush skills video and you're practicing painting your lines, it's very similar but onto a surface. If the paint is too thin and the PSI is too high, there is a risk of pooling or splattering. If you're just, again, misting on, but at a very tight circle in very, very fine lines, just going up and down. You don't have to be too neat, because if it does stray for 1 or 2 passes, it's going to be very faint. Though when you work up and down the line constantly, still allowing it time to dry in between passes, it should produce a very straight, very clear, crisp line. Again, you might see a lot of tutorials on myself doing very neat lines for pre-shading. If you are fairly new, it sort of slightly splatters, far too thick, you make mistakes and it sprays all over the place. Don't fret, because you're going to be colouring in the centre of it and dusting on further paint, so it's not going to be too noticeable except for the edges, which will be covered in paint more or less. So if you do feel that you want to do it neater, again, just practice your lines and just practice colouring in corners of a couple of loose pieces. But it shouldn't take too long to get it tight and neat enough that it's going to be sufficient for general modelling. I've just had a lot of practice at it. Now, colouring. I'm going for a green. I've got the paint a very dark green. A Zaku Gundam green, a lighter Zaku Gundam green, which doesn't make sense to buy 2 very similar but different shades greens, but it is a good idea, and a tan. The idea is the post shading is going to be mostly and solidly the dark green, and slowly focusing at the top and gradiently shading downwards is going to be the lighter and lighter colours, making it look like the top area is receiving the most of the light, probably a bit of a dust, and at the bottom it's shadowy or darkish. Now, post shading from a piece that's been primed and pre-shaded black lines around the edges, panel lines and recresses that are quite shadowy and dark. Forgot to mention in the pre-shading, the areas that you want to highlight is all edges, parts are going to be underneath that's solid black, panel lines and any sort of lips or edges. Just use your imagination where you want lines to stand out. When you pre and post shade alone, it just looks like outlines and dirt and dust is collected in the actual recessions and panel lines. Though if you combined it with other light-based shading, it's going to go for far more definition and realism. So you're definitely using a little bit of your imagination with the pre-stage stage when you get it neat enough. Now, the post stage is important that you get that right and solid first, and that it's a fairly consistent colour uniformed on all pieces of the intensity of the lines that are coming out. Very easy to do, by the way. At a very tight spot, you colour in all the primer areas overlapping on the black lines. Again, the neater the better. Does not have to be super neat. When each area is coloured in and not a single bit of primer is exposed, you pull the piece back and just gently rocking the trigger at a very low PSI, dust on and shade on a little paint. You'll notice that the dark lines will gradually become lighter and lighter and get it to a intensity that you're happy with, but have it a tad dark because you're going to put more layers of paint and more dusting on top. If this was your only layer, then yeah, go heavy. For lighter colour models, you can pre-shade and undercoat with different colours other than something really dark or black. Now for the base colour. The base colour is going to be the main colour that's going to be quite uniformed across the kit. This is again thin 50-50, 15 PSI. It is coloured in from the top of the piece where it's quite light to the halfway point, and then I generally try to shade it and mix it in with the darker colour near the bottom by pulling the trigger as closed as humanly possible. Pull the piece back and just dust on the slightest amount of paint, a little more dusting on the more darker end, making sure that it's obvious that 2/3 of the kit or piece is the base colour and the bottom of it is quite dark and showing the dark colour. As you notice, as we're going to higher and higher post shading coats, that it's quicker and quicker to spray and using significantly less paint. Also less PSI, and you're generally pulling the airbrush further back and dusting more. For the highlights, I'm only painting the top third of the piece very, very lightly, colouring in the centre, allowing colour bleed through of the base coat and the black lines from the pre-shading. Pulling the piece back and ever so only lightly dusting the top proportion, allowing the main base colour to come out quite strongly. You do not want to overly pollute or overly saturate the kit with the lighter colour, or your kit's going to generally look quite light in general, and you lose the definition of all the layers of shading. Be consistent on each piece. The final coat is either a white, tan, a light dust colour, a sand colour, and generally at just the very top piece, very, very lightly, almost like you're dusting, but in a concentrated point, you just blast on the tiniest bit of paint over the green highlight, just to give it a bit of colour, bit of variancy. It looks like there's maybe a little dust settling on the top, or light reflecting, or atmosphere, or some sort of excuse. I just find it quite effective in more weathering and weathered kits terms. If you're to do this on something that was absolutely clean and on high gloss, then you'd probably want to go more to a white than a sand colour. Now, this is just the process that I've used for this kit and this kit alone. After that, a little more further shading can occur. Once it's all together, you can get a bit of black and just ever so lightly shade the very bottoms black for more definition. You can shade a little more dirtied or weather colours at the very bottom of the feet and lower shins. You can dust on from afar a little bit of a dark brown dirt, and then on top of that a lighter dirt, just to have atmosphere dirt stuck on the lower feet where it's making contact to ground. You could really use your imagination, experiment a bit. Don't be afraid to shade on all sorts of different interesting colours like rusts or whatnot. Be adventurous on the main base of the kit. It's just going to give it more definition, more flair, more interest when you look at various different components and pieces, especially for weathering. Now, the colours that I've used are only what I felt like that would have looked good. There's no theory or no absolute correct method of the selection of colours and how heavy or how light you shade. I have been advised by MOTD, a Gunpla Builders World Cup champion of Australia, that the more extreme and more heavy you go in certain areas that's light-based airbrush shading, the more definition, the more interest, the more it's going to draw the eyes. And just don't be afraid with playing with extreme different colours, which I'm doing at the moment. Also notice the areas where it's grey or the little orange bit, that was hand painted or masked on, and a little bit of black has ever so slightly gently been airbrushed underneath, and a little bit of tan on top. This is unmasked, this is completely free-handed, just to blend that colour area in with the other colours. So again, just use your imagination, just experiment. Do this on some scrap kits or a kit that's not very important when you're doing a new painting style. I've experimented this with two other kits that are all different methods, the Zaku and the Gaza C, in light-based shading. And by the third model, I felt comfortable enough to do this Leo, but it's technically my fourth attempt as I stripped the paint off. And to tell the truth, with just how I explained it through the video and this process that I went through, it was a tad time consuming, but I'm fairly happy with this result. You can use less colours, you can use more layered colours, you can have 10 different colours and just layer them over each other. It doesn't really matter how you do it, as long as you are fairly delicate in the actual dusting and spraying process, and most importantly that your airbrush is well maintained and cleaned well in between coats and colours, or otherwise errors can occur, and that's when your paint can be damaged. All in all, thank you very much for watching, as always. Until next time, I hope this video was informative, a bit helpful. Next video will probably go a little more heavier in maintenance, and then again I'm probably going to paint another model, probably looking at masks or a different complete style of painting on a military or tank kit over the Gundam stuff. But I think just when I'm working on a component or working kits, I could do a little bit of talking about painting after or before the maintenance of an airbrush in this series of video. Let me know if you like it or not. Catch you guys later.